Hi, everyone, and welcome to KMM Not So Live. I'm here with Coach Mike Boyle of Body by Boyle, Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning. Just wanted to give a brief introduction. Coach Boyle has championship rings. He has clients that have won Olympic gold medals. He has very successful people in all walks of life that have passed through his doors, including interns who have become the backbone of the strength and conditioning community. And want to talk to Coach Boyle today as an entrepreneur and as a person who is present at the creation of an industry. So, Coach Boyle, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. I love doing these.
I appreciate it. Just to start, I grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts. I think you grew up in Malden. Talk a little bit about what it was like growing up. I believe your dad was a principal and a coach.
Yes. So I grew up going to practice. My father when I was little, he was coaching basketball. And then as I got older, when he got to be principal, he stopped coaching. But we grew up in gyms. I think that was my mom's way to get us out of the house, was to make dad take us to practice. So we would basically run around the high school. And I can always remember Saturday mornings we'd be the only people in the school, and we could run up and down the stairs and go to the wrestling room and go down and pretty much do whatever we wanted while practice went on. So it was a great way to grow up. But I'm very, very lucky. I think when you grow up where my father was basically a teacher coach, my mother was a school secretary, you grow up in that kind of environment. And I don't think you appreciate it at the time, but as I look back on it now, it was amazing to be in that environment when you're a little kid, and to be, being on the sidelines at football games. We were cleat cleaners, we were errand boys, but we were just very much in the midst of some really wonderful people.
Now, were you a particularly gifted athlete yourself, or was this something that you kind of worked at and became a product of the hard work over the years, or is it a combination of the two?
No, I was particularly not gifted, I would say. And I think the reason, and it's kind of common to strength and conditioning coaches, I feel like strength and conditioning coaches, as a rule, were either not good athletes who had to work really hard to be maybe a little bit above average, and or were really good athletes who got hurt. And I think most everybody seems to fall into one of those two categories. It's almost unusual to find someone who says, yeah, I was an amazing athlete and I never had an injury, and somehow I ended up in strength and conditioning. So
it seems that when you went to Springfield College, and it seems that that's the backbone of the strength and conditioning industry right now, in a lot of ways. Also, you guys have John Cena, which is pretty good. If you just want to talk a little bit about what made that place so special, what enabled you and other folks to emerge from there with such a good vision for what you wanted.
Well, it's interesting. I have a son who's going to be a senior, and I would love for him to go to Springfield College, and I can't convince him that that's the right thing for him to do, which to me is a little bit sad. But if you know anybody that went to Springfield College, it is a really unique education in the sense that if you went, basically there is, I'm sorry, and I'm going to be fidgeting around here a little bit,
no,
but
that's all right.
There's basically a physical requirement to the school in terms of everyone has to take what they refer to as skills and techniques classes. That is independent of what your major is. So it's kind of like everybody at the school has to take gym, but the reality is that everybody in the school, or not everybody, but probably now still more than 50% of the people are there for some sort of teaching, coaching, people helping profession. They actually have in their mission, I think they can't have a major that does not relate to some sort of service profession. And even I think their business program is called Business for Nonprofit Institutions, I think deliberately because of the way the mission of the school is. So we were immersed in everything that there was to know about sports, in terms of when you took a basketball course, which was required of a phys ed major, you had to do about 100-page notebook where you were diagramming drills. That course was taught by either the basketball coach or the assistant basketball coach. We had to take tackle football at the time when I was there, and it's changed. Obviously, it was 45 years ago, but everyone had to take tackle football. It was a requirement. So regardless of what your background was or what you were thinking about doing, if you were a physical education major, you suited up in the spring and you played tackle football. we took water stunts and diving. We had to do, they called it freshman camp. We had to go to freshmen to basically a campground that Springfield owns, which is actually still in Springfield, Massachusetts, believe it or not, on a little lake there. And camp the last week of school your freshman year. They were just, there's a lot of unique educational things that went on there. And you were taught that you could teach or coach any sport. That was sort of central to the thinking. So I had a woman named Dr. Mimi Murray, who I luckily was able to see a couple of years ago and thank her. So she's probably, I'm in my 60s. She's probably, I would say, in her 70s, late 70s. And she taught a class called Organization and Administration of Physical Education. OrganAd was this sort of the slang for it. And everybody had to take that course. And you always hoped you got to take it with Dr. Murray, because I think there was her and one other person that took it. But early on in the class, she made note of the fact that she had coached national championship teams in, I believe, volleyball and gymnastics. Wow. Although don't quote me, I could be wrong, but had never played either sport. So I remembered coming away from that class thinking, wow, it's not important to have actually played the sport, because Dr. Murray won national championships in both sports and she didn't play either one. And that was not unusual at Springfield, that there would be people coaching or teaching in disciplines that maybe weren't their primaries. So it was just a really unique place to get an education. And when you talk about kind of the backbone of strength and conditioning, I was really lucky. So I got there in 1977, and our graduate assistant football coach was a guy named Rusty Jones, who, if you look up NFL strength coaches, Rusty is now the longest tenured guy. He was in Buffalo for years and then retired, and then is now back in Indianapolis. And the other guy, who was actually my dorm director, which made me doubly lucky, was a guy named Mike Woysick, who prior to Rusty was the longest tenured guy in the National Football League. And they were graduate students at Springfield when I was there. So they brought in graduate students. They gave those graduate students responsibility for, in a lot of areas, to teach. Mike was the throwing coach for the track program. So he coached basically shot put and discus. And Rusty was coaching football, and then I think freshman football. So, and these were all guys that were there right at the ground floor of strength and conditioning. I always tell people, when I went to college, there was no such thing as strength and conditioning. At least I didn't know that it existed. I didn't realize that there was potential for that to be a career. I guess probably maybe right around that time, Boyd Epley was starting to dabble in it at Nebraska. So there were some people doing it, but I didn't know they were doing it at that particular moment. So it was very, very much the infancy of the profession.
Now, how did you get started at BU? I know you have a long relationship with Boston University.
It's the same way everybody gets their first job. My father knew somebody.
There you go.
And that's the reality of the situation. Sorry, I'm trying to find a comfortable position to sit for the next whatever.
No problem.
But my father's teammate, my father actually is in the BU Hall of Fame for football. So interestingly enough, my father played football at BU in the heyday of BU when they were a national power, when they were playing Syracuse and Army and all these big time football programs. And at the time that I was applying, his teammate, a guy named John Simpson, was the athletic director at Boston University. So I applied. I had gone to school for athletic training because I thought that was what I was going to do. And there was an assistant athletic training position open at Boston University, and I applied. And I think I was qualified anyway, but it certainly didn't help that my father and the person, at least doing the beginning part of the selections, was a teammate of his. So I'm not ashamed to admit that at this stage of the game. And I got there, and in 6 months, I realized that athletic training was not what I wanted to do, that I didn't like it. And strength and conditioning, now Mike Woysick had gotten a job at Syracuse. Mike had left and was now the football strength coach at Syracuse, and still the throws coach. So he was still working with track and field. So most of the strength people at that time were dual rolled, and Rusty Jones had gotten a job in the USFL, for those of us that are over probably 55, and with the Pittsburgh Maulers and the Pittsburgh Penguins, because the DeBartolos owned both the Penguins and Maulers at that time. So they had bought a USFL franchise. I think this might have been it might have been before they owned the 49ers, or they might have owned the 49ers and the Penguins at the same time. I can't remember. But so I realized, wow, this is a field. This is happening. This is legit. And I just quit my job. I quit my athletic training job. I quit my paid position. I got a bartending job, and I basically went into this little teeny weight room that we had and kind of appointed myself the strength coach. It was sort of, I walked across the hall and sat down and was like, hey, here I am. I'm the strength coach.
So what's it like building that from the ground up? How do you get buy-in from people at the institution? How do you establish more of a formal field, or is it just trial and error at that point?
I think at that point it was very much trial and error. And I was very, very, again, I always say, and I guess, we talk about sort of what the definition of luck is, right? And I always say that I was lucky, but I probably wasn't lucky. I was very much in the right place at the right time, and I was around the right people at the right time. So the basketball coach when I first got there was Rick Pitino. So we used to play pickup basketball with and against Rick Pitino, with Coach Parker and a bunch of other people. Coach Pitino left before I ever coached a game, but his assistant, John Kuster, and again, if you're a basketball aficionado, John Kuster was a longtime NBA coach, but more importantly, John Kuster was the other guy on that amazing North Carolina team with Phil Ford and I'm trying to think, Brad Daugherty. Like, he was basically
those early '80s teams.
Yeah. So he had just come from North Carolina playing for Dean Smith, and he was the one that was the first one to quote unquote hire me. He said, I need somebody to run preseason basketball. Do you want to do it? And I said, yes, I do.
Yeah.
So that was the start of
BU had some talented basketball players during that period of time too.
We did. We had a guy named Gary Plummer who, and if you're a basketball fan, you'll remember some great Gary Plummer, Reggie Lewis games during that time period. And Gary went on to play in the NBA, did not have his probably as storied a career as Reggie Lewis had, but he was a real good player. And we were lucky. These were the guys. Pitino had recruited these guys. Gary Plummer, Tom Ivy. We had Sean Teague was our two guard, the father of George and I can't think of the other Teague brother, but the two Teague brothers that played in the NBA are Sean's kids.
Marcus,
and our point guard was Brett Brown.
Oh,
went on to coach. So one of the stories I always tell everybody is that you don't know who you know. You never know who people are going to be somewhere later on down the road. And again, for us in basketball, we were immersed in this really high level group of guys that had started with Coach Pitino. And then obviously it's 1981 or 82, probably at that time. We're just coming off the 80 Olympics, and you're at Boston University. One of the first guys that walked in the weight room actually was Dave Silk. Dave Silk came in one day and asked me if I would. He said, I'm going to Germany. I'm going to play over in Germany. Would you help me with some programming, some off-season programming? So I got to meet Dave there. And then Dave and Mike Ruzioni were both assistant coaches for us at different points in time when I was there. But so there I am, in the midst of these 80 Olympic guys and what's going to eventually become the movie Miracle in a whole nother dimension. And strangely enough, my business partner now, Bobby Hansen, his son played Dave Silk in the movie Miracle. So when you talk about how small the world is,
it all comes together. What made Jack Parker so successful? Between the national championships, the Olympians, what sort of attributes stand out?
We could do the whole podcast just on Coach Parker in terms of, I think what made Coach Parker so successful, in all honesty, it's a number of factors. One, I think he was probably way too smart to be a coach. I always said he would have been a great lawyer. He was a hard guy to argue with. And I think that made me a much better coach, because I was in here trying to really change the dynamics of a sport. So I think, hockey was coming out of the, smoking cigarettes, beer drinking era, and was trying to move into this sort of more scientific era where people are going to train in the off season. And one of the great things, what made Coach Parker really good, was his ability to adapt. I think people who probably knew the 1970, 2 or 4 national championship Jack Parker would not have recognized him in a staff meeting or in a team meeting when we won the national championship in 2009. So he was able to win. When you think he won in 3 decades, He won in the 70s. He won in the 90s. He won in the 2000s. He coached till he was 70. He is the single winningest coach, I believe, in one sport at one school in the history of the NCAA. I think he won 790 some odd games. But what makes him so great? I remember people said so. I think it was 796. If I might be a little bit off on my numbers.
Right,
but
because I
someone
think
said,
York and Mason are split between multiple schools, right?
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And somebody had said, well, you're going to hang around and coach maybe just coach a few more games to get to 800. And he was literally like, who gives a shit? 795, 800, whatever. And other people would have been so caught up on, getting the 800th win, doing all this stuff. He just didn't have that. He didn't have a big ego. It was all, he always talked about, it's not about me. He always used to talk about hockey. He said, hockey's not about the coaches, he said. And he would kind of dump on football and basketball. He's like, football and basketball, that's all about the coaches. He said, hockey's not about the coaches. Hockey's about the players. And he was just brilliant. And he was the guy, I think the thing, and Coach Parker is an underappreciated guy. I think because he deliberately wanted to be an unappreciated guy. I think he intentionally, I always used to say to people, and I'll try to not swear too much in this podcast, but
that's all right.
I think some people, Coach Parker would like some people to think he's an asshole because that would mean those people were going to leave him alone and he wouldn't have to worry about him. And I think that was a big part of his MO, because the one thing that made Jack Parker unique in my experience was that he was the greatest crisis manager I've ever been around, because he was there. When we had 3 real crises during the time that I was there, in terms of Travis Roy broke his neck, which was one of the worst days of my life, in all honesty, of going through that process and realizing that, okay, one of our players was paralyzed. That's, thank God, that it's only happened in 40 years. I've only known 2 players that it's happened to. And when Dennis Lang got hurt, it was the same thing, even though it wasn't really kind of on my watch, I guess, at that point in time. But
it's on your hat. Yeah.
Oh yeah, terrible. I mean, our goalie JP McGursey actually got hit by a car a couple of years later and had a really traumatic brain injury, and he had difficulty regaining his ability to talk and walk and all that stuff. And then we lost Mark Bavis on 9/11. And in every one of those crisis situations, Coach Parker kind of showed his true colors. He was the guy who really pulled everything together. And I think that was the stuff that I appreciated most about him, that the people who don't know him probably have no understanding of. And I think he went out to eat with Travis once a week for, let's say it was 1996. So for, Travis passed last year. So it was over a 20-year period that he probably went to dinner once a week with Travis. And the difference with him, he didn't care if one person knew that. And he probably didn't want one person to know it, to be perfectly honest. He was better. So I guess what made him an amazing coach was that underneath the exterior that he wanted to present to everybody, the guy with the glasses falling off his head, screaming at the referee, was this incredibly intelligent, incredibly caring guy who everybody, and I will tell you this, I don't know one person who calls him Jack who's been at BU I've never referred to him as Jack in my life. I've never looked him in the eye and said, hey, Jack, what about this?
Coach Parker.
Everybody calls him coach. And pretty much, except for his true peers, his friends that are his age. And these are guys who've gotten their own coaching jobs, guys that are coaching in the NHL. If you saw Mike Sullivan right now and he saw Coach Parker, he'd say, hi, Coach, how you doing? And Sully's 50 something years old and, has won a couple of Stanley Cups himself. And he probably couldn't spit the word Jack out in front of Coach Parker if he wanted to, and wouldn't try. He wouldn't even try. That's the difference. None of those guys would, John Hines, who's coaching, none of these guys would even think about it if they refer to it's coach or Coach Parker. And I think when you garner that level of respect, that tells you and tells everybody else how you've treated everybody that you've come in contact with.
Right. And it seems like when you get that level of respect, it's not only the breadth of your contacts or the breadth of your experience, it's the depth you have with all those individuals too.
Oh, unquestionably, yes. I mean, I think everybody, I always tell him, and I've told Coach Parker this myself, so I'm not afraid to say it on the podcast. He's the most influential person in my life beyond my own parents. I think I've learned more from being around him than anybody else that I had contact with. He's the reason I stayed at BU way longer than I should have. And I turned down a whole bunch of professional opportunities that probably would have made me significantly more money than I would have made at BU. But being able to be part of that relationship was an amazing thing. One, the guys, we recruited unbelievable kids.
Yeah.
And I worked in an amazing environment where my work was appreciated. And I think these are all the things that people don't understand about jobs, but what makes a job great is working in an environment where people appreciate you and let you do your job. I mean, we were able to revolutionize how people train for hockey because Coach Parker let me do it. I mean, he let me do things that I don't think at other schools people would have let it happen. I think people would have stopped me at certain times and said, no, you can't do that. And we had one conversation all the time. Mike, will this help us win more games? And I'd be like, yep, I firmly believe this will help us win more games. And he was like, okay, question answered. Well, let's do, whatever it was, lifting, running, buying equipment, we were at the forefront, particularly during the 90s. And I think, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, during the 90s, from like 90 to 2000, I think we went to the Final Four 9 times in the 10-year period. If I was to go back and look it up, I'm pretty sure. And I think we played in 3 final games and won 1 championship during that time. So we really were the dominant program of that decade.
As much as it pains me as a BC grad to admit that, that's 100% true.
Yeah, I think honestly, and that's what truly it made BC better when Coach York got there.
Yeah,
that was one of the things, and they were the dominant team of the 2000s.
Yeah,
and probably had a very, very similar run. I think they actually won 3 championships during that time. But I firmly believe that so much of that was rooted in that rivalry and the fact that, okay, we're not going to spend 20 years being second to BU.
Yeah. Coach York's nephew, Will, was a classmate of mine at BC High. And, because Will was such a class kid that whole family's just got to be class.
They are. Coach York is just an amazing guy. My daughter spent a semester at BC, finishing up her hockey career this year. And the first person from BC that texted me was Coach York when he found out that she was going. And he texted me, he said, finally one Boyle comes to their senses.
When did you realize that it was time to go off on your own and start your business?
When honestly, there were 2 things. My business just got too big. BU was really generous in letting me run summer camps. And I started out with 8 pro guys. And the next summer I had 16. And then the summer after that, I took some high school kids, started with a bunch of Belmont Hill kids who actually interesting. One of those Kit Hughes, who's now the Holy Cross AD, was one of those initial Belmont Hill kids. A lot of kids from that group have done really well, but every year it just kept growing and kept growing. And I knew that this sort of private strength and conditioning was going to be a thing.
Yeah.
Because I was seeing what was happening just to our summer program. And what was going on with us was I had all these kids. I had kids who would have driven to Boston year round and trained, and their parents would have paid for that. But once school started, I said, hey, I got too many athletes to come back. I can't have high school kids running around here.
Right.
And so eventually I thought, all right, I'm either going to be the guy that starts this, or I'm going to be that guy who was always talking about, oh, I should have done that. And I didn't want to be the guy who's saying I should have done that. I wanted to be the guy that did it. So it was a situation where I just kind of took the plunge. The good thing was we didn't have a whole lot of money. I didn't have kids yet. It was just my wife and I. And it was the kind of deal where, hey, if it doesn't work, I can go back to BU full time. It was great. BU was nice enough to sort of let me stay with hockey. And I basically demoted myself to the assistant, and we elevated my assistant, then Glenn Harris, who's been there. I think Glenn's been the head guy now for, this is 2022, probably almost 25 years.
Wow.
Another Springfield College guy. And so I became the assistant and basically took primarily a hockey job, and then started working on this idea of opening my own business.
This is a question I selfishly have because I'm a career coach and I don't pretend to know everything. I've made enough mistakes for everybody. But I heard Tony Robbins say, and this might be from Jim Rohn, that the quality of your life and the quality of the things you do often rests on the quality and number of distinctions that you're able to make. And when you're assessing an elite athlete, how did you learn to make assessments from good to great, great to elite?
I think honestly, it was pretty darn obvious, to be truthful, at that stage, in terms of, I think it's different when you're looking at kids and trying to project what a kid might be. But generally speaking, when you're around the really great ones, you kind of know who they are. I was lucky enough. I worked for the Bruins during the 90s, and it was pretty easy to figure out that Ray Bork was maybe a little bit more committed than some other people were. And it wasn't hard to figure out that a guy like Cam Neely had sort of a combination of toughness and physicality and charisma and hands that was really unusual. And I mean, I've been lucky. I've had, Brendan Shanahan was a client. I've had so many of these guys as clients that it never really seemed hard. It didn't seem like there were a lot of mistakes being made, whereas, oh, this guy is being underappreciated, or this guy's getting screwed, or this guy isn't getting the opportunity that he's getting. Like, I never saw that. And I think that helped make me a better coach, because when kids started complaining about things like that, it was very easy to say, I don't think that's the case. And even at BU, it was one of those things where it was always a meritocracy. The best players played. And the best players didn't always play all the time if they weren't behaving as best players. I told this story to somebody yesterday, but one year, I couldn't pinpoint the actual year, but we played up at Lowell, and I think we actually played Lowell at BU on a Friday and lost in a kind of lackluster game. That Lowell was not what Lowell is right now in the Norm Bazin era of Mass Lowell, and should have been an easy win, and it wasn't. And we went up there the next night, and Coach Parker told our first line that they weren't playing, that they were not dressing, and he played 3 lines. He didn't even dress 3 more guys. And he put these 3 guys in the stands in sweats. And he mentioned to them, as an aside, as he's walking away, he goes, "Just so you know, I told the press none of you are hurt," and then just kept walking. And so suddenly our best 3 players were left after that game to fend with a couple of reporters and explain why they had to watch in sweatsuits in a game where we only played 9 forwards, when they would have obviously helped us. And I think we ended up actually beating Lowell that night with 9 forwards. But that was the kind of stuff that, Coach Parker in particular held people accountable for their ability.
Yeah.
And again,
to those much has been given, much is expected.
Exactly. And he was a big believer in that. I think he probably benched almost every great player that we had at some point during the course of the career, because for that consistent lack of effort. It's like, if you were the best player, then you better be the best player every night, at least from an effort standpoint. You don't have to be the best player on the stat sheet, because the puck may not go in, but you should be doing all the other things that will make you be that guy. And he always talked about that. You want to be that guy, then you got to be that guy every night, every day.
You got to do that guy's things. Yeah.
Yep. And that was why I honestly believe that's why so many of our guys went on to be great pros. That was why we had such a massive run again during that 90s period of, the Mike Sullivans and the Joe Sackos and Sean McGeckrans. And I mean, we just had, everybody on our team thought they were going to play in the NHL, because it seemed like everybody did. And a lot of that was because there was a massive accountability factor that it was unavoidable. You were either accountable or you were going to watch, and nobody wanted to watch.
Right. Now, whether this is inside athletics or outside athletics, what is the best example you've seen of a person? Because I know talent obviously is super important. We all have what we have in terms of size and explosive muscle tissue. It's that fast twitch muscle, et cetera. Who has taken what you might consider ordinary gifts and turned it into an extraordinary life or an extraordinary career?
Oh, that's, I hate to say it because he was such a really good player, but I would say Chris Drury, to be honest, only because when you look at Chris Drury, you realize that I think in succession, he won the Hobie Baker Award. He won the Rookie of the Year, the Calder, I guess, is Rookie of the Year in the NHL, I think. And then I think either that same year or the next year won the Stanley Cup. And now you look at him and he's a general manager in the National Hockey League. And I would not say that Chris Drury was the greatest athlete I've ever worked with in terms of if we're measuring athletic ability by how well, I always say there's like Michael Jordan athletes and Larry Bird athletes. And if we're measuring it by Michael Jordan athletes, Chris Drury wasn't the greatest athlete that I ever worked with. But if we're measuring it on the Larry Bird scale, he might have been the greatest athlete I ever worked with in terms of he always did the right thing. He always made everybody around him. I remember it was really funny. His freshman year, he was our fourth line center when we won the national championship in 1995. So imagine how good that team was when you realize the guy who's going to win the Hobie Baker Award is center in the fourth line at that particular point in time. And interestingly enough, we went over and we played Harvard at Harvard, and his brother Teddy, who had been a great player and was a great, great player himself, great NHL player. But every time he touched the puck, they chanted, "You're no Ted." And I remember it burned him. He was like, because he's a freshman, and every time he's touching the puck, you keep hearing, "You're no Ted, you're no Ted." And I remember, I think sophomore year, I think he had 2 or 3 goals against them. And I walked by him and I looked and I goes, "Damn right, you're no Ted." And he just kind of smiled at me, and he ended up being, obviously Teddy was a great player, but Chris was a better, ended up being a better college player than Ted and a better pro player than Ted. And I think part of it was just he had incredible work ethic and diligence. And he was one of those guys who, people talk about someone kind of being a sponge and absorbing everything that you wanted him to do, but he just was that guy. He was the best leader. He was the best player. He was the best guy. He was the best friend. He was everybody wanted to be Chris Drury.
Does every great athlete or performer or entrepreneur have to have a little bit of screw you, I'll show you in them?
I would say every entrepreneur, yes, because the one thing about business is that suddenly talent doesn't matter anymore. That's been, right. And I always thank God for that, because if it had all been just talent based, I think I might still be in trouble. But I always think the things that you learn, and I started writing an article about this one time that I never finished, but I think the things that you learn by not being a real good athlete and trying to be one make you a really good coach or a really good business owner, because you learn how to work really hard and maybe not get a whole lot for it.
Yeah.
And whereas I think with just strictly, like, I've been around, some super high talent guys who probably never really lived up to their potential. I've been around too many, unfortunately. But so I think that's the differentiating factor, is some people that have talent never realize that talent. I tell people all the time that potential should be a swear. When someone says that you have potential, they're insulting you, because what they're saying is you haven't done it yet.
Right.
And so I think, in looking at it from that perspective, people have to be able to look at that and think what you want is realized potential.
Yeah. I think sometimes potential feels like you're living inside a balloon that's made of metal, that no matter how much it expands, you're not going to be able to push your way out of it.
And there are those people who, and I mean, again, you can talk about sports, but I think a lot of that is parenting in terms of, and with some people, it's just too much success too soon. I think there's a lot of variables that come in there that can make those things problematic.
What if you have an athlete or a person in your life who is stuck? What are whether it be in terms of plateauing in performance or getting a bad case of the screw-its, what are some things you do that can break them out of the rut?
I think the biggest thing is get them to look in the mirror, because most of the time it's 100% their own fault. So I always say to people, the mirror room is a really uncomfortable room when you have to go in there and look at yourself and really ask yourself. Because when I talk to teams, a lot of times, particularly younger teams, one of the things I'll say to people is that if I said to you, how many of you want to play professionally or play Division I or do whatever it is, you're all going to raise your hand. I said, the moment I tell you what I expect you to do in order to do that, a lot of them are like, "Oh, let me get that hand down," because I didn't realize. And that was my standard talk at BU every year. I'd look at all the freshmen and, who wants to play in the NHL? Boom, everybody, I want to play in the NHL. Who'll do anything? Hand stays up. I said, okay,
Let's
prepare
not
for the
defining anything.
yeah, prepare for the definition of anything, because I'm going to start telling you what anything is. And suddenly guys are like, we got to get up in the morning. You expect us to go to breakfast? And I'm like, yeah, I expect you to do all those things.
Mhm.
And those are the things that are really going to determine who goes to the NHL and who doesn't.
Yeah, a buddy of mine is a professional wrestler who coaches independent professional wrestlers, and he has almost the exact same experience when he talks about, all right, are you interested in making it to a WWE or at that level? And once you start to get into the specifics, and then you combine that with the mirror, yeah, people get very uncomfortable with the inventory they're taking. But it
Yes.
seems like, it's if you're gonna make it, it's inevitable that you have to take that inventory and you have to look in the mirror.
Or you have to be really talented. I've seen
Yeah.
some people, I'll be honest, I've seen some super high talented people who maybe never did the right thing during their whole career, but were just so talented that it didn't matter. And those are the worst ones to be around, because those are the ones who make everybody else think that's possible.
Right. And do they often have the least understanding as to why they're great?
Yes, generally speaking, they do. They have the least, I think they have the least understanding of everything. They tend to be a little bit delusional because they've just when you're that guy,
Yeah.
you've probably never failed, or that girl, in terms of you've just never bumped up against a big negative.
I falling on my face has been one of the biggest gifts of my life. So no, I appreciate
Yeah, I
that.
also, being like, for me, being average has been one of the greatest gifts of my life. The fact that I wasn't particularly talented, that things did not come easy to me, is probably the best thing that ever happened. I have a son who's the sort of polar opposite in terms of everything's easy.
Yeah.
And it's a real struggle sometimes with him, because he's one of these kids. He's a good looking kid. He does pretty good in school. He tends to pick up whatever sport he tries. He just tried out for the golf team. He's tore his ACL, which is probably the biggest negative that he's had, but hasn't golfed in 6 months, has never been on the golf team, and decides he's going to try out for the golf team, and he makes the golf team. It's like, and sometimes I look at that and think that's a little bit of a curse, because I'd like there to be more struggle.
Yeah. Now, just to kind of to switch subjects, you mentioned on, I believe it was one of the strengthcoach.com podcasts, that data-driven studies and more of the math nerds are starting to take over pretty much every occupation, whether it be within sports or software or whatever, software swallowing everything. How do we bridge the gap between coaches and practitioners on the one hand and the data folks on the other? How do we bring the best of what everybody has to offer
I
into an
think what
environment
they
that works?
need to do is they need to bring more coaches back into the data world, because what's happened now is management in a lot of sports has started to be dominated by sort of the Harvard and Yale NBA type, MBA type of guys.
Right.
And there's less of the guy who played in the league and works his way up through. And that's really good, because that's allowed a lot of the leagues to become more progressive. But the difference is, I think a lot of those executives can't get over their own fascination with data and with computers. And what we're seeing is we're starting to see sport being viewed as more of a hard thing than a soft thing. And sport is still about people. That's why the guys, the great, whatever sport you're in, manager, coach, whatever they're going to refer to you as in that particular sport, will generally be great handlers of people. When you look at like the Steve Kerrs or, the Phil Jacksons or those types of guys, or Bob Johnson, what stands out about them with everybody that talks about them is how they handle people. No one will ever mention Steve Kerr and what an unbelievable analytics guy he is, and how he's crunching the data, and he realizes that the 3-point shot is the key to the whole game, because, you're getting 3 for every 2, whatever it is. No, you never hear a word about that. When you go back through listening to the old era Bulls guys talk, you don't hear that about Jackson. When you talk to guys who played in Pittsburgh for Bob Johnson, you just hear literally about it's a great day for hockey, like that. I mean, that was him. That was not bullshit. That was Bob Johnson. And we're losing sight of that. But what's going to happen is the pendulum will swing back. Because what will happen is these sort of the money ball, data-driven organizations, people will realize, okay, that really isn't going to be the key. We got to get good guys in here. We got to get a good manager in here. We got to get people that are good teammates. We've got to have a good staff. All that stuff's going to matter. It's not going to be, oh, we've got to have the best analytics guy, and we've got to be able to look at on-base percentage, and we've got to be able to look at the spray chart and figure out who can hit into the shift. Like, all that stuff will eventually become irrelevant again, and they'll go back. And that's, unfortunately, I think that is the nature of sport. It's kind of like I always said with football. If you watched football always copied.
Yeah.
In terms of whatever, all of a sudden Bill Walsh, okay, everybody wants a Bill Walsh guy. And then it was Parcells and everybody wants a Parcells guy. And then it's Belichick and everybody wants a Belichick guy. And then when all the Belichick guys don't do well, everybody looks back and thinks like, what happened?
Right.
And you're kind of like, well, this doesn't really work. In terms of, it's not, you can't duplicate the person, or you can't duplicate the skill set just by taking somebody that worked in that particular organization. But that's sort of how professional sports operates.
Right.
It operates, to me, I think it operates for $1 billion organizations now. It operates at a very low intellectual spot, I think.
Right.
I think they don't. There's too many people who think they know what they're doing. And when you think you're the most dangerous person out there.
Screwed. And and one of the things that when it comes to sports, just as a casual fan, that I see is that change seems to come only when things go radically right or radically wrong. So for example, offensive linemen after Lawrence Taylor are dramatically different than offensive linemen before Lawrence Taylor. Systems change because of, oh my God, I can't do this, or oh my God, I can't stop this. There seems to have to be a real need. But also,
it's interesting, but it's almost a little bit of kind of Sybil, multiple personalities. I always look at the Red Sox in terms of the year that my last year, 2013, we win the World Series. And we win the World Series, and all they talk about is the character of the guys in the team, the Ryan Dempsters and the David Rosses and the Johnny Gomes is, and all those guys. And, what a great character team was and how that was the key. And then they go out and they sign guys that they know are not character players and give them the biggest contracts on the team. And you look and think.
And then lose character guys over 500 Gs.
Right. Yeah. And then you look and think, what happened? Like, how did we not learn the lesson of 2013? And then you look and think, it's just the way sports is. I don't understand it, to be particularly honest. I would look at it and think, I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing from a business perspective that's making me successful.
Right.
And if I'm going to look at that and think, okay, we went with a particular formula and that formula produced a championship, then I would continue with that formula. But that formula that year was, we're going to sign 6, 7, 8 really great clubhouse guys that we think are going to make us a better team. And they signed, like I said, Victorino, David Ross. I mean, they did an unbelievable job. They guy was really lucky when I think of the guys that I got to be around in that short period of time. I mean, I had, amazing, like, Andrew Miller, John Lackey, John Lester. I mean, we had unbelievable pitchers. We had unbelievable character guys. And then, like you said, they suddenly seem to shift in a different direction and think, we're not going to re-sign some of those guys, and we're not going to bring in the next generation of those guys. Maybe because sometimes what happens is those guys get recognized for the value that they have, and then someone else wants to give them more money because they want that same value, that same intangible, and they're willing to pay more money for it. But I think it was that ability to find those guys with those great intangibles and then bring them in and make that into a group that produces that sort of literally worst to first transition that we had during that year.
Yeah. To kind of bring that together, is part of this that the analytics guys they essentially, when they come in, have as much knowledge of a major leaguer's routine, lifestyle, and then their personal inventory as a regular person, instead of having a sense of, okay, this is what a major leaguer has to do every day to get where they're at?
Well, I think it could be that. It's not always that way. Some of the analytics guys can come from better backgrounds than that.
Oh, good.
I think the problem with that is just that there is there's too much attention paid to the analytics right now in terms of it's, as with any industry, it gets away from the soft skills. And I firmly believe that the soft skills are where the real magic is in any organization. When people ask us, why we've been successful at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, we've been successful because we've got really good soft skill people. We've got super likable people that people want to be around. And that's what drives our business. And I think when you lose sight of that and I don't care what organization you're in, what business that you're in, when you lose sight of that, you're headed in the wrong direction, and you're probably not going to be long-term successful.
That's the truth. I just want to ask a couple questions. I know you're a voracious reader, so just want to ask just quickly, what are a couple books that you recommend to people who are just getting started in business or just getting started, or books that you would recommend in general to anybody?
So if I was just getting started in business, I would read Simon Sinek, Start With Why. I love that book. And I think it's great for people to try to figure out what their why actually is. There's another really good one by Adam Grant called Think Again that I love. Oh my God. First Break All the Rules is maybe one of my favorite business books, Marcus Buckingham, because interestingly, in a lot of the things that we talked about, in First Break All the Rules is about a massive study that Buckingham did. I think 25,000 employees or something like that they interviewed about job satisfaction. Yeah. And the interesting thing that they found out in First Break All the Rules was that money was not in the top 10 of reasons why people either liked their job or stayed at their job. And things like feedback, have I been told that I do a good job, was in the top 10. Do I have a best friend at work? Do I have the tools I need to do my job? Well, there were so many things. And that's, again, for us at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, I look at that list all the time. And I'm always reminding myself, do I tell people, like I look at some of our employees sometimes and I just remind them, I said, you are really great. I love I love having you here because you're really, really good at your job and you make us better. And I know they go home thinking that makes their day, because I think anytime your boss, I can tell you that I don't know if anybody, again, besides Jack Parker, has ever said things like that to me. And I don't think, Jack, he would be honest. I can remember, like, perfect Jack Parker story too. He wins Coach of the Year. I think he wins National Coach of the Year. He calls us all into a staff meeting and he says, we won Staff of the Year. And, and I'm kind of like, what? And he's like, we won Staff of the Year. And, jokingly, it's like, no, you won Coach of the Year. He's like, no, we won Staff of the Year. And stuff like me, like he would take me, I got to go to the coaches convention every year, all expenses paid. My wife and I would go every year. And that was part of my reward. So you get, a weekend in Naples or 4 or 5 days in Naples every year with all the other coaches, because he was like, you're part of the staff. You're a big part of what we do. You're a big part of the reason that we win. Right. And that's the kind of stuff that makes you turn down jobs that are purportedly better or going to pay more money or whatever it is, because you can't measure appreciation in dollars. Right. And you can't measure the ability to do your job in dollars. And you can't measure the ability of somebody to furnish you with the tools that you need in dollars. Right. And even, I was a big part when we designed Aganis. He was like, what do we got to have downstairs? And I remember saying to him, we need 7,000 square feet. He was like, the architects say that's too big. I was like, tell him to screw. Yeah. We need 7,000 square feet downstairs. And he went and fought with the architects because they wanted to put, a 2,000 square foot weight room like they were putting in a lot of those buildings of those eras. And I said, no, if we're going to have a hockey specific, our own weight room, we got to have a big enough room to do what we want to do. And he just stuck to his guns with the architects and said, nope, this is how big it's going to be. Make something else smaller. I don't care what you make smaller. Take space from somebody else, but the weight room is going to be the size that Mike says the weight room needs to be. Right. All of those things, that's the essence kind of the Buckingham book, is this realizing what actually motivates people. And that's back to the soft skill thing, right? Everybody thinks it's money. I'll offer more money. It's not money. Most people are not financially motivated as a primary source. And if they are, they're probably not in sports.
Right. And I think just with clients I've had, my experience has been the key word with money is the word enough. if that's enough, if that's met, if it's not enough for you, it might never be enough for you. But if you're at the point where you feel like you can meet your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or in some cases you don't even have to, like you said, the congruence of the values, that is, like you said, appreciation, believing that they believe in you and trust you. Yeah, that's been resonant with my experience too. So that's great. I guess just one last question before I get you to talk about your social media, and then we can wrap. What are some of your personal and professional goals for the next 2 or 3 years?
Honestly, I don't have a professional goal for the next two, but I guess I do. It's to get my business transferred. We're transferring or in the process of starting to transfer it to some of our employees because I want it to go on as it is. So that's my professional goal, is to create a really smooth transition where these young guys who've been with us for a while and do a really great job eventually can become owners. That's my professional goal. My personal goal is to be able to just keep watching my kids play for as long as I can. My daughter signed with the Buffalo Buttes in the Women's Professional Hockey League.
Congratulations.
So PHF, wow. Now it's called Professional Hockey Federation. That's a story for another day, but the old NWHL. And so I'll get to watch her play another year, which is a bonus because I thought that might be the end of that, and get my son back from his ACL and get him figured out where he's going to go to college. He, at least right now, he's thinking he wants to play Division I lacrosse, which means he'll have to do a prep school year because he's missed his junior recruiting season, which is when all the recruiting actually gets done. So, but those are the things that I want to do personally, and be able to be in a situation where my wife and I can travel around freely and watch any game we want, anytime we want, and have no restriction based on. The great thing about owning your own business, I never have to think, oh, I have to work, because I don't have to work. That's what's right. As long as I can,
it's just what you do. Right.
Right. I go every day that I'm around, and I like to go every day. But if I decide I want to go to Buffalo, or if my son is in prep school someplace and I'm going to go watch a game, then I'm going to go watch a game.
Coach Boyle, thank you very much. Can you just let people know where to find you? I know you're a big Twitter guy.
I love Twitter, which is where we met.
Yeah.
I am mboyle1959 on Twitter, and I am Michael_Boyle1959 on Instagram. I have more Instagram followers than Twitter followers, but I like Twitter better. So I'm definitely more of a Twitter guy. And you mentioned our business website, if somebody's local north of Boston, is bodybyboyle.com. That would have been another great story at some point, but Body by Boyle was never my idea, just for the record. But I'm stuck with it. So,
Coach, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure. As I said, I love to do this. I honestly could do this all day. I hate setting them up. I hate thinking about doing them. And then when I do it, I think, wow, that was a really fast hour.